Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for part one of our webinar series on securing the future, the critical role of operating reserves for nonprofits. Our speakers today are Mike Gellman and Patrick Curtis, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Thank you, Nicole. Patrick, I'll go first. Really excited to be here today. And before I even start my introduction, Patrick, this is a big part of my life. I don't know if that's a good comment or not, but operating reserves is a big part of what gives me guidance each day. And I hope this first part, you'll see that a little bit. But I am a CPA. I've worked in public accounting most of my career and got to work alongside Patrick for a number of years, but I like to say I am a normal person. I'm not an auditor or a tax preparer. I've always worked on the consulting side, and really sitting around, next to the C-suite between the CFO and CSO, Chief Strategy Officer. Budgeting, operating reserves are a big part, helping to give guidance and looking forward. I divide my time into thirds now. We run a consulting practice, fiscal strategy for nonprofit, where we help the C-suites for NGOs and nonprofits. About a third of my time I'm teaching classes. My home base for that is Georgetown University here. But I do a lot of conferences. I'll be at the next week at the BBCon conference out in Seattle, which is the Black Bard conference, and do a lot of United Way, ASAE, and such, and National Urban League, different types of groups like that. And I try to say, Patrick, and I think you and I agree on this, and I'll hand it to you off this. My wife and I, we try to allocate a third of our time to be active volunteers and sit on as many boards as we can. And I think you always get back more than you give, and you can learn a lot, but you can really help, and especially from a finance area, really help change the direction of an organization. Patrick?
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. So my name is Patrick Curtis. I'm a shareholder with Rubino Company. And like Mike said, we used to work together many years ago, and he's been a mentor of mine for quite some time. I started out my career as an auditor, and I did about, 14 years of auditing in the last, I don't know if it's 7, I don't know if it's 10 years, but I've switched over to being a full-time consultant. And I work with our outsourced accounting team. And a good portion of our practice has always been nonprofit organizations, and just having discussions over the last 7 to 10 years about organizations, about what are my reserves, how much should my operating reserves be. I mean, this became sort of incredibly, it's just critical to what I do on a daily basis, and part of it is sort of protecting organizations from their reserve policies. And I'm gonna bend Mike's ear on that a little bit later, because he's kind of the expert in this. But I've kind of developed this fascination with this particular topic. And Mike and I were chatting in the hallway one day, and I said, "Hey, is this something you'd be willing to do?" And he said, "Absolutely." So I'm super happy to be here today, talking about this topic. And hopefully it's of some use to you participants. And
Excellent,
please
Patrick.
ask questions at any time.
Yeah, break in on us. We're going to do this in 2 parts. The second part, we'll go back over that. I think it's October 8th, and we'll review the timing and everything. Part 1 here, we're going to talk about covering the basics on operating reserves. And we don't mean that from a basics like a concept. It's like we need to cover the basics. There's a big separation, Patrick, to me between, I think I've never found a nonprofit organization that didn't have good ideas. What I have found is nonprofit organizations that aren't well-funded, capitalized enough to be able to act on a lot of those ideas. And so operating reserves is the key, and you'll hear this over and over again. To me, it's a little unfair, Patrick, but I think you can't rely on one factor, but for me, it's the most important factor when I'm gauging financial health, sustainability, continuity for an organization. I see an organization has operating reserves, a whole bunch of things flash in front of me, and organizations that don't need to get there. And
my eyes, when I look at the statement of financial position, it goes straight to the equity. I want to see what their unrestricted net assets are, and then I look at the composition of the balance sheet, and it's a pretty quick calculation to figure out what their operating reserves are. And from there it's okay, good shape, or the what I always fear is that you're going to see an organization that's undercapitalized with nothing but temporarily restricted net assets. And that can be a very, very difficult situation to operate in. So this is a critical topic for all of you guys.
So we're going to do part one. We're going to cover the components, and part two, we're going to get more into the strategies and the messaging. And on part two, I will tell you this, Patrick, and we'll comment on this 2 weeks from now. Oftentimes I think it's 10% problem solving and 90% positioning and messaging. And you'll see that in part two. I've seen organizations that have the policy, but they're not getting there because their messaging is bad. So we're going to run into operating reserves now. We broke this up into a number of pieces. It's an essential component of financial health. You can already see that Patrick and I firmly believe this. Patrick, you've heard me talk about, I do my 60-second test on a balance sheet. I open it up. Test number one, is the balance sheet in balance? We look at it, we know we do it, but we do it. If it's not in balance, we don't look at it, right? And
Move
my
on.
second
Yes.
one is I quickly make sure it's in balance. And then I go right like Pat, I go to the net asset section and I'm looking to see, what's going on there. And if there's operating reserves, is there a hint of operating reserves? And we're going to talk about that. And so it's always, that's my personal bias. And Patrick, let's just throw these up there for a second. I think confidence and trust. I open up an organization. I've done this in the car. I open up the 990. I can see it on page 11. And I see operating reserves or I don't. That raises my level right there. I always feel like, the healthiest organizations attract the most funds, Patrick. And the reason is, to my mind, is people don't want to support an organization that's not going to be around for a long time, that's in danger of disappearing. Okay. And
I agree.
The that, Patrick, is how does Harvard, Stanford, and Princeton every year fight in the media to say who raised the most money? I get to work on a lot of UN projects. There's 192 countries in the UN. Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford have more money than half of those countries. And yet they're still raising money. You know what I mean? Why?
Got to have more.
Not an accident. If you're strong and healthy, right? They want to support that. It must be well managed and well run. So don't you think that that's huge? How many board meetings have you been in? And
I do.
People are ignoring the balance sheet.
I do. And I'm going to sort of build on that a little bit and say sustainability and continuity. That's probably the thing that I think about the most. I come from working in the grants world. And the federal government recently, in the last 10 years, implemented a program by which it has to assess the financial capability of grantees to complete their grants. I mean, they were beyond looking at, do they have good internal controls, and they were beyond looking at, do they have good ethical policies. They went straight to the heart of the matter and said, do they have enough money to perform on this grant if we give it to them? Or are they going to get in trouble through maybe no fault of their own, maybe just sort of timing a cash flow? Somebody was slow in paying them, and now they're sort of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. So that's how I think. I think, unfortunately, I think a little bit more compliance than Mike does. But to me, it's the most important part of this. And so I like looking at the balance sheet to see where they are from a sustainability.
Patrick, there's always a natural tension between, compliance and the future, and strategy and where you're going and having an impactful organization. And you've heard me say that, do you want a clean audit? Yes. Does a clean audit mean you're a well-managed organization? No.
Nope.
But do you want a messy audit? No. And we have to have that. And unfortunately, with nonprofits, we have to have really good internal control procedures and all that. We have to show we're following the rules. But at the end of the day, it's how are we delivering on our mission? And that's where the other three come in. Patrick, you hit the nail on the head. If we're a financially healthy organization, people are not scared to fund that, especially when you're going after grants. They want to see stability and all that. And then the third one is that you're able to be the leader on joint projects, do innovation. Okay, back to my thought, I've never seen organizations that didn't have great ideas for the future. Can they act on them? But if you have operating reserve, you have working capital, and you can now invest in programs and grow and things. So I think that's really important. So Patrick, I think I would love to hear you and I talked yesterday about how do other people, goes across their mind when they see operating reserves? What are some of the actual or perceived benefits? And if you could
Yes,
pop this
please.
to the
So
chat.
to our participants, if you could go ahead and pop some thoughts into the chat, we'll kind of look and perhaps share our thoughts as well. But we'll give you a minute or so, and we'll take a second. And by the way, you mentioned, and I'm going to come back to this, but you mentioned working capital, and sometimes boards don't think that operating reserves represent working capital. And I want to explore that with you a little bit later. And
Yeah,
how do we message?
Right.
Go ahead.
And Patrick, I don't mean to interrupt you there. It's what you and I think is semi-irrelevant. We have to figure out what's inside these board members' heads and help them to get there. And a lot of times they have different perceptions around. So anything pop into the chat here on other
We got a
areas?
couple.
Yeah.
Being able to give maximum notice to staff of layoffs when things go badly. Yeah. That's certainly an issue. Covering gaps in funding from Cardwin. And I think that's definitely it. So, there were a couple of thoughts there. Obviously, we want, if we have sufficient operating reserves, actually there is never the right amount of operating reserves. Is that a fair statement, Mike?
Yeah, and let's go back to that first comment, because I know that's a pretty much in your face comment, but you know what? To me, that's a caricature, Patrick. React to this. People are often in denial. Is an organization slipping? Is it not? It's hard to tell by just looking at a budget. But on the balance sheet, I think operating reserves are like blood pressure reading. You can see if the blood pressure is going up or down. And when
Sure.
operating reserves will quickly react to that. And I've used that with staff and things, not to say, why we're doing layoffs or furloughs or something, but to just say, hey, look, we're 4 months in a row. Operating reserves have been dropping during a time when we usually had operating reserves. And so that's the way I've used it with staff.
Yeah. I think that operating reserves are much more for bridging that gaps in funding. And they're not going to fix systemic issues with your organization, right?
Exactly.
So if your program fails or some form of funding just goes away, it's not going to cover kind of what Kim was saying, but it will give you a little more runway.
Yeah.
If you have to.
And with what Patrick's saying, we got our first polling question up here. And if you could just take a look at this, what's your knee-jerk reaction? Because operating reserves are there for both of these. They're there for short-term disruptions, and they're also there for long-term sustainability, working capital, invest in the future. And what do you feel is the primary one? And it'd be really interesting to see. There's no wrong answers here. And then I'm going to, Patrick, you know me, I'm not bashful. I'm going to share my feelings about this question.
Yeah, I'm aware.
We'll give everybody a few minutes to pop it in.
Okay.
And then Nicole, can you sort of track when you have enough responses and the poll?
Yes.
Like so far we're tracking almost 50-50. A little bit more short-term than long-term. Patrick, which box do you think I'm checking?
Support future growth strategies.
Yep, it's all about that for me, and we're going to talk about that. Nicole, can you display for people where it's shading towards almost 50-50. It's shading towards the short.
We had 7 for number 1 and 5 for number 2.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I favor the long term, but I have a quick story to tell on this, Patrick, as we're going to go in and look at this. There's a real difference between the short term and the long term here. The short term, and the key word here is people don't define short term, and you might change. And to me, as Patrick alluded, no operating reserve can help you again with a long-term or sustained change. They can help you with a 1, 2, 3 month exchange. And that's why for me, short-term is 3 months or less. And in some instances, I'll go for a 6 month, that we have to bridge a gap like that. But never, like the pandemic, that was around for a long time. We shouldn't be using operating reserves. We should go and rebalance. And so you'll see examples of a short term where, a new grant, was temporarily rescheduled. We had a delay of some kind. We had even a snowstorm, and and it's there to bridge that short term. We had a temporary staff, but on staff, we had to hire a temp for 1 or 2 months while someone was on medical leave or something. Okay. Versus the long term, which is really why we build these reserves, is a healthy organizations looking to the future. Healthy organizations are constantly evolving and changing, and they're investing now for the future. And that's what the reserves in my mind are there. But Patrick, here's my story that I was using the other day at a class I was teaching on this. And I really like this one. I wrote about it on the website. Think of a new individual who is recently starting their career, starting a family, has no money. What do they focus on? That first 1 or 2, putting away that first 1 or 2 months in savings for an emergency.
Yeah.
What if there's a disruption? That they're not thinking about the long term. They're thinking about getting started. And if everything goes really well, within a year or two, they put away that 2, 3, 4 months, that they've got the rainy day funds for. And that's all they should be focused on. But after you have that, then you can start dreaming, right, about the future. Putting away short-term money is almost a compliance issue for me. It would be poor management if organization didn't put that away.
No, you need
Once
to.
you have that, then the rest of the funds are for investing in the future.
K fund. Gotta put it in the 401k, max it out.
Yeah.
And then anything above and beyond that is for having fun. I agree.
Exactly. So let's get into this core purposes, a reality check. We talked about this.
Kind of talked about it.
No operating reserve is there to protect you against a long-term change. So operating reserves can protect against short-term non-reoccurring and such. So here's a quick example of, we talked about a couple examples. Has anybody had to dip into operating reserves for to help bridge a short-term change? Anybody want to share examples? Patrick, you and I have seen.
Well, I'll certainly give some thoughts.
Sure.
It's a client that has cyclical funding, sort of that, that typical trade association that has a conference and they have their membership dues, and perhaps the conference is a little too far spaced out from when the membership dues year starts, and they might have to bridge a gap between when their cash balance starts to decline to that conference, which is then going to sustain them for the rest of the year and bring them back around to doing the membership again. So that's probably the best example I can think of. How about you?
Yeah. Anybody else have an example in there? And to me, we look at those as temporary disruptions. And I think the most important part is not the example, because there's infinite, Patrick, is that set your window. Ideally, it's 3 months or less, that the impact of that thing will be over within 3 months, sometimes up to 6 months. But you guys remember, then you're talking about, the exposure of, depending on the size of, obviously, if it's a small event you have once a year and it's delayed 6 months and only nets $5,000, even though we might. So you're also looking at the dollars, and such. But Patrick, looking at the time, I think we're going to move ahead into how we set the goal, in the policy. And let's just get there. Everybody asks, what should our operating reserve goal is? And I worked on the NORI project many years ago, the National Operating Reserve Initiative. It was jointly sponsored by United Way International and the Urban Institute. And we had over 100 organizations, a lot of universities participating in it. After 5 years, we never came up with the goal for operating reserves, but we did all agree on one goal, which is that we all agreed, not on a goal, that any organization that has less than 3 months of operating reserves is in a weakened position. Those are the exact words, a weakened financial position. And so to me, that was worth the 5 years, because now what I say is if you don't have operating reserves, you want to get at least to that 3-month goal and not be in a weakened position. But most of the time we're looking between that 6 and 12 months.
So
they're building reserves to go lower level. Yeah.
I'd agree with you. And so we Rubino, we worked on a project with a federal agency that issued a lot of grants, and they were evaluating the financial capabilities of those grantees or the grant applicants, and we sort of evaluated them from the ability of them basically their operating reserves. And we never put a particular number on it. But you know, there were some organizations that literally had nothing. It was cash, you know, whatever, $10, temporarily restricted, you know, $1 million representing their grant. And there was sort of a single purpose entity that was there simply to perform on that project. And anything that goes wrong makes that organization not able to function. So
They're
that is
this close to going over
razor's edge. I mean, one lost receipt and they're hurting. So that's the extreme. The other organizations, I mean, you could see them with 12 months or 18 months of operating reserves. And those are the people you felt really comfortable with. I'm good with your definition of less than 3 months.
Yeah, that was come uniformly over 5 years, and feel good about that. Now, I will say this, and we're going to get into the operating reserve policy here in a few minutes, Patrick. I have never set the goal to be more than 12 months, but I have lots and lots of organizations that have more than 12 months.
Absolutely.
And we never apologize for it. So let me just restate one thing, Patrick. My quick litmus test, don't have anything, want to get to 3 months. If your initial stages of building, set the bar lower at 6 months. If you can exceed that, don't keep the bar there, but don't raise the bar above 12 months. And the way I tell people to not feel guilty about it, I've had organizations got 4 and 5 years, but Patrick, think about this, and we're going to see this in an example worksheet in a little while. An organization that has 24 months of operating reserves, 2 budget years put away on the expenditure side. Most organizations want to grow in the future. What that organization can state, and what I always state to the board, is that we are financially healthy enough to double in size, and we would still have adequate operating reserves. And we have built the foundation of the house. You see what I mean? Now everyone's double in size, but you can grow into your reserves. And that's why I always like to try to have a little bit more, because as the budget grows, you'll see. So should my nonprofit organization have an operating reserve policy? What's the answer? Definitely. I believe all organizations have one. It's whether you have a formal policy or you have an informal goal. And informal goals are not necessarily bad, but I think the operating reserve policy is a legacy document that you're leaving to future board members to lean on. Okay? And I mean that.
Makes sense.
And I think when organizations done this, and you could look back 10 years later, board members would go, oh, thank God those guys put together this, certain policies. And one of them is an operating reserve policy. It really will help guide the organization, and you'll see. So we're going to walk through an operating reserve policy now. And Patrick, we're a little bit behind, but I'm going to pick up speed here a little bit.
Just go ahead and speed through this.
There's 4 components, and we're going to cover all 4 of these. And we're going to be fine. The first important one is to improve the understanding of why we have operating reserves. Then gaining a consensus for that, because this is not an exact science. This is not like a cash management policy, which is pretty template. Okay, we want to talk about if you're not in a good reserve position, to get in that mindset to start accelerating towards building the reserves, and then make sure people understand how this is huge to continuity and sustainability for an organization. So an operating reserve policy here, and Patrick and I are just, if you reach out to us, we have some sample templates. There's a lot up on the SC4 Nonprofits website. On operating reserves. You go to the archives section, you'll see dozens of articles up there, and we're going to show you some things, but we have some templates to share with you.
Okay, and I want to point this out to you folks. This first bullet point here is my favorite.
Yeah.
And I'm going to let you cover it, but it's my favorite.
The 4 parts here, a lot of work policies will only be 3. I like dividing part 1 into 2 parts. What is our goal in terms of mission? And then what is our goal in terms of dollars? And it's just so important, and we're going to spend the time. Then just so you see, part 3 is coming up with tying that goal into our budgeting practices. And so this is the way you can have a budget policy for budget surpluses or deficits.
Do we have time for a quick story, Mike?
Yes, 1 second. And then part 4 real quick is a status reporting. Go ahead.
Awesome. So I was on the board of a Head Start agency a number of years ago, and one of the first things I saw is that we just didn't have an operating reserve, and to me that really scared me. And we had several programs that we offered, and we knew that just intuitively we're never going to get $3 million reserves so we could run a Head Start program for a year if the funding cut out. Because what was that going to do for us? It lets us operate for one more year, that mission, but then it basically bankrupts us. So we decided to pick that part of the mission that we felt the community couldn't do without, and we wanted to have funding that was available to run that program, and sort of the basic operating needs of the organization. And so we chose the food bank, because that's one of those indispensable resources that a community needs. So that was our defining our operating reserve goal in terms of mission. We didn't know we were doing it at the time, but that certainly worked. There you go.
So Patrick, you had an elevator moment in my mind. Go back to the first 3 or 4 words out of your mouth. You getting to know a new organization, you saw your balance sheet, you saw they were very low on operating reserves. What happened to C&T, confidence and trust? It took a hit. And how many seconds did it take? Just a couple.
3
seconds. You see what I'm
seconds.
saying? That's why I call it an elevator moment. All of a and these are out there. Now, what if what happened is and all of a sudden you see, oh, they got adequate or even more than in just a matter of seconds, even before the organization doesn't have a mouth, but before they open their mouth. And that's the key to me. So let's talk about this point here. And Patrick alluded to this. When we're setting up an operating reserves, we really want it to be tied in to the mission and purpose for very, very selfish reasons. And my selfish reason there, Patrick, is that when we message about operating reserves, the message is always positive. That our goal isn't to build up $1 million operating reserve. Our goal is to have the funding for our 2 largest grants already in place for 6 months. Our goal is to have our key program A or B funded for 6 months, to have half a year membership put aside and such.
Yeah.
And so the dollars turn people off, but I feel good if your Head Start program has a whole semester put away, right?
Agreed. Defining things in terms of dollars makes people feel like, why are we saving all this money when we should be using it to help other people? Right. But then if you say like that, well, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to put away this amount of money so we can run that program for another year. If we were to lose all our other funding sources, that's got to make people feel good. Board members can get behind that.
Yeah, and the organization, I talked to you about this. Remember the one that was doing workforce development for seniors? Yep. During the pandemic, everybody was at risk, but who was most at risk? Seniors could get back to work later than others. You know what I mean? And just the idea that they were able to continue funding their programs during a time when these people are going to be delayed more than others. They got so much positive press out of it. Contributions actually went up. Even their funding went up from Department of Labor because they were strong and healthy, not because they had too many dollars. And so it just really came back. Patrick, this is just a couple examples. You shared one, but having these kinds of things at the top. I will tell you that I have personal things defined in operating reserve policies that you equate to the organization, 150 recipients for 6 months. And then we have generic things that we want to have funds, up to 3 months of these funds can be used for unexpected short-term changes, the hurricane hits and such. And so we do have, temporary disruption, loss of power, those kind of things. And we did have that again in COVID too. We were working with a number of community-based organizations. Remember in the beginning, the COVID vaccines had to be kept at super high refrigeration levels. And one clinic lost power, and they lost over $100,000 worth of vaccines literally in a day. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And now that we corrected that, but that was a short, but that's the kind of things that happen. And so this is just to, spark your, how you can state your goal in terms of the organization that selfishly makes you proud to talk about having operating reserves.
All right. Do any of you folks out there, any participants have any thoughts on how they could define their operating reserves in terms of mission?
Yeah, even for an organization you've worked at or currently working at, or have you seen some other examples? Patrick, I love R&D, which stands for rip off and duplicate. Anybody's got a good idea here, we love to hear it.
Not heard that before, but that's very good.
That's what it's, yep. I'm just keeping an eye on the time, but we're at a good spot here.
All right. Well, we're not getting a lot of thought. Oh, there we go. Okay. It's a good point.
Okay.
There certainly are some organizations out there. I work with
You want
one.
to read one or two? We have a minute to go over one or two. Yeah.
So we have we've got quite a few coming here. Allows us to keep our independence rather than accepting funding that is outside our preferences. Love it. Like absolutely. To fund grant match requirements. Very nice. I like that too. And I like the bridge gap funding for grants. Absolutely makes sense. Thanks, Sherry and Cardwin and Kim.
Yeah, perfect. And I think when it comes to grants, there's always going to be some disruption, right? How many grants do we finish? They all, especially if you get a 2-year grant, everything goes exactly to the calendar. It really does, right, Patrick?
No, and if that renewal is 30 days late, and in the meantime you don't want to let go of your people, because that sort of hurts you when operations start back. So there's that balance, right? How long can I keep them on, waiting for the new grant to come, versus do I go ahead and let some people go? So having the operating reserve really sort of smooths that problem out.
Exactly. And again, C&T, confidence and trust in the organization to be able to manage through, and yes, having the resources to do that. So let's take the mechanical side now. We're proud of our mission. We're proud of how much reserves, how that relies to our mission. Now we need to convert that to dollars. And at the end of the day, we do want a number. So even though we're saying 150 people in a program for 6 months, what will that equate to? When we're trying to build up an operating reserve of, somewhere 50% of an annual operating expense budget, and then, up to a year. And you're still describing it very uniquely to the organization, but you're coming back to the number of months that you're building up. And again, my default is never to equate the dollars to the months. And you'll see as we go through here, and especially when we come back in 2 weeks, Patrick, I want to talk about that a lot with our case studies.
Yeah, we're going to get very, very, very specific next time around, folks. It'll be good.
So we're just here. So Patrick, you know me, I've always been more of a strategy guy and not the best, systems accountant. But I think in general terms, I don't think you have to overcomplicate the computation of operating reserves, but they are the liquid funding. So they're in the net asset section. They're the unrestricted without donor restriction dollars. And then they're the liquid portion of those. So if you have a building, I've seen organizations that are underwater where the building, they look like they have a lot of unrestricted, but the building's not liquid.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And so that comes into play.
And you got to understand that accounts receivable, if you're heavily invested in AR, that's part of your operating reserve. Right. It's also part of your working capital, right?
So I like leaving current assets and current liabilities, but again, in your policy, you can define your formula. There's no GAAP formula for operating reserve, generally accepted accounting principles. So you want to be clear, and that's why another little check mark, Patrick, for having a written operating reserve policy. You can put down in there so people aren't guessing, how do you calculate your operating reserves?
Okay, well, let's move on, and I'm going to hit you with my big question in a couple of slides. Okay.
So we see that. So staying in this part too, the goal in terms of, and I like the percent of the budget and the number of months because it's easier to out there. And I just want to talk about this, use a standard scale message so that when you're doing like a dashboard, your monthly reporting, your annual reports, you have a basis that your measuring goal isn't always, moving around. Okay. And have like a little, you don't have to call it this, but everybody has their red zone, yellow zone, green zone, and whether you want to start faded or not. And to us, you want getting north of 3 months, under 3 months. If I don't know anything about the organization, I'm sort of following these, Patrick, and I think most people would.
No, I think this is great. I mean, I couldn't recommend anything different.
Yeah. And And you talk about like in terms of months, not in dollars. I always keep that because budgets will change over the time, but we have 3 months in and such. And so I always think it's less scary to board members when you talk in terms of number of months and not dollars. And I think you have to be attuned to how your board members absorb this. And Patrick, this came to me many years ago. I think I told you the story when I was in diapers, just getting started in accounting. I was sent up to Johns Hopkins University in one of their research labs, and I was scared because these were all multiple PhDs in there working on these grants, and they did a great job on the grants, and we're coming in and I'm checking, ticking and tying, you know what I'm saying? And I sat down with one of the scientists who was working on it. I said, accounting is as simple as math. It's add, subtract, multiply, and divide. We don't do anything with exponentials and long algebraic equations. And he goes, Mike, you don't get it. You go, what do you mean you don't get it? He said, it's not the math, it's the dollars. And it came to me, he said, this brilliant scientist is the same scientist who goes home, is managing his family budget and figuring out what he can afford in groceries.
Right.
It's not the counting of the $3 million. It's $3 million. I might not see 3 million my whole lifetime. You know what I mean? That
Yeah.
was scaring the crap out of him. And that's when the light went on. And I said, I got to do a better job talking to these people. And, it was the weight of the managing that $3 million grant, not the math.
Makes sense.
And it just like the light came on for me on that. Going into section 3 here, this is very important because this is a little bit unique, but I believe the operating reserve gives you a way to define your bottom line. Most organizations, they get to a bottom line that they're just comfortable with, but they don't have a mathematical equation for it.
Say
And so
bottom
I
line,
have
you mean the
bottom line
budget of the budget. Okay, good.
Exactly.
How should my budget be even? Should it be level? Should it be deficit or surplus debt? Right.
And
Good.
I believe all organizations are at one of these 3 spots. They're either below their operating reserve goal, let's say it's 12 months, or they're near their operating reserve goal, or they're above their operating reserve goal. So if your goal is 12 months and you're sitting at 3 months, you're going to try to budget a little bit larger bottom line. So you see 3 to 5%. I usually don't go above 5. It's hard to put away more than a nickel. If you're at 12, 11, 12, 14 months, you're right around your operating reserve goal, we could start to have a little bit tighter bottom line, i.e. one of the benefits of having an operating reserve. And then if we're above our operating reserve goal, you never go down to 0. But because of inflation, other things, and some wiggle room, I just like to have some. But you see, and then this is unique to each organization. And we just say to people, hey, we have an operating reserve policy. We're hovering in, so we need anywhere between 2 and 3%. Our bottom line should be there. On the first draft of the budget, it was only at 1%. We're going to go back and sharpen our pencils a little bit. Okay.
And I feel pretty strongly that you should never have a level budget or if you've got a ton of money and you want to have a deficit for a year, that's fine. But having a level budget doesn't really help you because you're losing 4% to inflation every year.
Exactly.
So you've got to have some profit built into that budget annually, or that operating reserve will shrink based on its buying power.
Yeah, and Patrick, I think there's 2 things that will happen that will erode the bottom line without you have no control over. One, there's always some factor of inflation, number 1. Okay.
Sure.
And then there's this factor of timing. And I treat budgets like the stock market. You're not going to be up every year. There's, over 5 years, you could have 2 deficits and 3 surpluses and be right where you need to be. It's not better than a budget that went 4 years with a surplus and 1 year with a deficit. It's really looking at the combined activity.
I agree.
And that best year, mission-wise, could have been the year you had the deficit. But that's why we just, over time, you want to be trying to, get to a stronger position. But I think this helps organizations, 1, to think about their budget bottom line, and 2, to give a little bit of a guideline. So this is another added benefit from having operating reserve policies.
Okay. Excellent.
So I like, and then that statement in the middle of the page, to me, never factors in. I just want to be marching towards my operating reserve. I don't have to get there in 3 years. 8 years, 10 years.
I got to get past my board on this. I mean, they really wanted to get to the goal sooner rather than later. And so they wanted to do, and that would have taken a 10%, sort of surplus budget every year. And we had to sort of wrestle with that desire to get from here to there in a reasonable amount of time versus that amount that we're willing to spend on programmatic, expenditures. And we eventually, I don't know if I won or they won or whoever won, but the point is we decided not to go for 10%. We decided to take our time getting there. Now, we had a couple of fantastic things happen, and we got some really big contributions somewhere along the way, and we took that and put it to our operating reserve. So we got to where we wanted to be in a number of years, but our budgeting sort of stayed in that 5% range. We never quite got that high as 10.
I appreciate you sharing that, because this is where it becomes unique for every organization. And even those boards will change over time because the people will change. And
Yep.
just think about an operating reserve policy for an organization gets most of its funding from grants, and an operating reserve policy for an organization gets most of its funding from individual donors. You're going to have two very different perspectives. Okay. You could have an operating reserve policy for a C6 membership organization that's a professional trade association of engineers. That's going to be much different than an operating reserve that's a parent teachers association, type of thing.
Agreed.
And so I really think you got cultures, you got purposes. And then the last one I want to point out is I have an organization that gets a lot of its funding from planned giving, estate gifts. And those we treat definitely like the market. We don't know when those gifts are coming in. We look at them on a 5-year rolling average basis. Okay. But
kind of guess.
then the next day I'm with an organization that relies on annual appeals. Even though they're getting fundraising, they're just chunking along sort of the same each year because they have these big appeals that go out on a regular basis, the ones that come in the mailbox.
Yeah. I have an organization that look, I mean, they're very, very rich on the balance sheet because the board, and I swear to God, the board likes to play with the investment money. So the board never reduces the dues, and this impacts them too. They figured they would just set the dues at a level that allows them to have a significant surplus, and they keep adding to that investment. And at this point, it's god awful amount of money, but it works for them. Is the point? So
the point is you want to have an operating reserve. You want to go through the first 3 steps. The visualization is why Patrick and I separate out is into our 4th step. We're in the 4th step now, is to have a reporting mechanism so people can see it. You could talk a good game, and to use an overused phrase, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right, Patrick? And we rely on these schedules and dashboards and things, and have a report here. Now, we do want to talk about this, that operating reserves on a daily basis will change. To me, the important way is to do it after the annual audit, or after your year-end books are final closed, especially when you have revenue spikes during the year or something. And I like to say this was one of the times where I like to go back in time to let people know where we were on operating reserves. Were they lower? Were they higher? And then we could use the budget for the next year as a projection based on that 3 or 5% on the bottom line where we could be next year if we're on budget. And I think the report should be, yes, it's going to have dollars, but the emphasis of the report should be that number of months. Just like that,
or the mission
scientists at Johns Hopkins, the dollar scares the crap out of them, but they understand, number of months.
And they also report out in mission, right?
Yeah, that becomes the benchmark. So let's slow down here for a minute and take a look at this. And I want to point out 2 things. There's a number of different ways to do this. But notice the biggest font size is the bottom number, right? When you look at the bottom line and ignore the rest of the report, our operating reserves, the number of months going up or down? And they're obviously going down from 21, right, Patrick?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Now,
they're
everybody go to the blue line above it, which is their budget based on their budget. The operating reserves goal is going up. It's going up substantially. Their budget 3 years ago was 2 million. It's gone up more than 50%. It's now 3 million. Now go up to the next line. Their actual operating reserves have actually grown from 3.9 million to 4.2 million. If their operating reserves grew, why did the number of months go down? Because their budget went up over 50%.
Yep.
So this, and everyone will be different, but the point here is that this organization, and I take this anytime, is getting bigger. And they're getting bigger pretty fast, right? And
They are
that's
growing.
good. They're growing. And they've been adding to operating reserves mostly during that time. See how it bounces a little bit. But they're adding to reserves not as quickly as the organization is growing in size.
Okay.
And that, if you imagine taking that bottom line off the bottom yellow line, you'd have to look at it a little bit to figure that out. But that bottom yellow line to me is flashing. I can understand that. My dog understands that.
Another interpretation of the data is that they invested a lot in fixed assets. So their unrestricted net assets have continued to grow, but their net fixed assets, which is not liquid, right?
Right.
So it's not part of operating reserves, is reducing the actual operating reserves. So they're planning for the future. They're growing and they're planning for the future by investing in fixed assets. Maybe they bought a building, maybe they got more equipment, whatever it might be. But that then is resulting in a decreased actual operating reserves in a number of months.
And Patrick, you're very smart, and I say that so you'll continue to be nice to me. But this organization, the numbers without the backstory is meaningless. And you picked up on that. Look at their net fixed assets. They more than doubled, right? And I took this based off of a smaller museum that built out, added on to their facility.
Okay.
Ate up a huge chunk. But why did they do that, Patrick? Because the future looks really good.
Yeah, I mean, that's their mission. They want to display their whatever the issues are. Maybe there's some benefactors who want to see the museum grow. So they invested money to support their future growth.
Yeah, and it was an arts-based museum, and the museum was important, but they made their money on donations and art classes. And the new facility was more for classrooms and things. And now for the next 10 years, their revenue stream is going to be going up.
Okay, so they may have reduced their actual operating reserves currently, but that will grow over time as they recoup some of that funding.
Yeah, it was a really positive. I had another museum where they had raised all the money, not raised it, but got commitments. And then we looked at I said, there's something missing here. What are you missing? This is we got all the architecture, we got everything. What's missing is, what does the revenue stream look like for 3 to 5 years after the new building is in place? And guess what? When they did the analysis, they weren't doing classes, they weren't doing things. Their donations were going to tick up a little bit. They showed a flat revenue stream, but their operating expenses with a new building were going to double in size. More staff and all. And so you know what? The whole project got put on hold for a while. It wasn't the architectural plans, it was living with that. You build the library, now we got to run the library.
Yeah. So I was recently on the board of an organization, awesome little place. They run a farm in Columbia, Maryland. It's called Freetown Farm. And the state came to us and said, hey, there's a property, because we had originally acquired this farm. It was one of the last pieces of agriculture inside Columbia proper. And they came to us and said, hey, there's another property that we want you to be the stewards for. And we sat and looked at it for a long time. And it was really an awesome opportunity. We couldn't afford it. There was no way we could afford the operating expenses without some future grant commitments. So we went back to the state and the county, and we got some assurances. So we went ahead and grabbed it. And now we have 2 properties. I'm no longer the board, but I keep saying we. It's hard to stop saying that.
Well, that's a good sign of a board member who's committed, and that's great.
Absolutely. All right.
So Patrick, we're at 150, but we have one more piece.
No. I have to we have my big question, Mike, that I want to pick your brains on.
Okay, but recognize we have about 5 minutes left and we have one
right.
more section. Okay.
All right. So you're a board member and you look at this set of financial statements and you see unrestricted net assets. What's your initial reaction to that?
When I see just in the net asset, unrestricted net assets,
Just in the net assets, unrestricted net assets. What's your initial reaction?
my initial reaction is we're not sitting on a ton of restricted net assets.
Okay. Do you think of that $5.3 million as your reserve?
Yes, and then I have to look up the page to see if they have any non-liquid assets.
Okay, so I want everybody to pay attention to that. You really have to see what else is there. What's your working capital?
So for me, I do two computations of working capital, one for organizations that have buildings and ones that don't have that type of infrastructure. Because then the fixed assets for a non-building organization are de minimis. They're more,
Yep.
I don't want to mess with the formula, make people easy. And so
Agreed.
I can look at operating reserves. I got one that brought you because I got to stump you for a second. You ready?
Go ahead.
Same organization, same everything. They have a building. Okay. The building is eating up most of their unrestricted net assets.
Okay.
Okay. I still feel really good about their operating reserves, but I can't show it on a GAAP financial statement. Why?
I'm not going to get this answer. Go ahead.
Real quick, what can't we do on a GAAP financial statement is show
we can't show the increase in the market value of the building. Absolutely.
Yeah, and we know in that organization, they had the original property was donated. They have it was worth like $10 million and they had like 500,000 on the books on it. You know what I mean?
Okay,
and you can't, that's not a GAAP formula. We had to do something special in their operating reserve policy. We sort of show it with and without, and because that number changes, but you see what I mean? Now I don't do it if there's $10 of appreciation, but when you had 10 times the appreciation.
All right, Mike, we like 2 minutes, so I gotta jump back in here. What if you're a board member and you say, look at my operating reserves, $4.2 million in FY24. I want to take all that and put it in an investment account so that it grows.
Yeah.
How does that impact your organization?
Yeah, and that's why I would think we go here to number 5, and this is we want to leave you, I guess we're not supposed to do this, but think of this like the ending show of a season. We have to leave you hanging till it picks back up.
Yes.
And the key answer is there's 2 things. There's number 1, spending power established for organizations that have built up substantial operating reserves. You should have a section 5. If you only have 3 months operating reserves, we don't need a spending policy. This is we're going to use those funds in the future with some stopgaps. Okay, and we're going to talk about this when we're at the end of our presentation here. The other part is that operating reserves are there not never to be used, but to be used over time, and they shouldn't be sitting in a checking account. They should be investments. But I was just at a homeowners association meeting last night, Patrick, and it was
That's exciting.
Yeah, it was really good because 2 homeowners were fighting. It was really fun to watch. Homeowners association, where we have regular infrastructure, where betterments, improvements we have to do, we're not investing those operating reserves, the reserve requirements, as aggressively as for a trade association or a member-based organization that's operating reserves that they're, you know what I mean? So you got to look. And so, for homeowners, we're usually allowing 20% or less, like in equities, but in a trade association, we'll be even up to 70% equities. And it's just everything in between. And I just like to leave everybody hanging for that because we're going to end with a polling question and everybody take a read through that. Just say, where are you at on your operating reserve? And do you allow for annual support of your budget if you're sitting on substantial? And we'll like to get your answer here, but this is going to be the starting point for our next discussion, Patrick.
It is. And I'm going to go back while people are sort of filling this out, and I allowed you to move on. But my point is that if you have that $4.2 million operating reserve and a board member or the board wants to take all of it and put it into an investment account, you have effectively bankrupted the organization because now they don't have working capital. So you board members out there or you executive directors, You need to protect that operating reserve and realize that your working capital is a subset of that. So I usually, and this is a little different from Mike, but when I'm trying to do a operating reserve discussion, I try and define my working capital and carve that out first, so that I always have that. I can always touch it when I need it. And then the rest, fine, board, go play with it. Have fun, put an investment account, 1%, 2%, 5%, whatever it is, that's great.
So let's end on the, because we didn't get anybody doing A, and I've had a number of ones in A, and this is what we wanted to see. It's pretty spread across the board, and we're going to discuss these into the future. Patrick, can I rebut you real quick on what you
Sure.
said? Because it's
Absolutely.
based on the organization. And the way we get around, even groups that have a fair amount of operating reserves, we're letting them go into what I call fairly managed investments. But if we're in liquidable funds, you know what I mean? We have to design the portfolio correctly. You know, how fixed income versus equities, and, you know, mutuals versus individual holdings, and, you know, and be able to balance out the fund. But that's all things that we're going to discuss when we get back. So I like that these results are spread. Okay.
Yes.
Can everybody see that? We just shared them.
I also really like.
We didn't get any, but I have a number that would have been A that I've worked with over the years, and we would have gotten like almost 20% for each. So that's
all right, folks. So we're going to end here very shortly, but I do want to acknowledge Cardwin, who said that we currently have almost no reserves. The board has a standing order that 25% of any true revenue in excess, if there's any at all, if there's anything left after costs are covered, goes to the reserve, and 75% goes to the general fund. Yeah, that makes sense. So, you know, they're putting some away, but they're also letting you continue to run the organization. I'd probably, you know, Carolyn, if you define what you think the reserve should be, it's going to help you guys start moving, right? It's going to get rid of the inertia, and you're going to start moving, and it'll help develop that. Mike, you agree with that, don't you?
I agree with your very ending statement, all of it, but the very ending statement is important. The benefit of going through assembling a formal policy has lots of benefits. That's what Patrick was saying on the end there. And to be able to have different opinions come in. Remember, you can't satisfy everyone. I want to be respectful of the time, Patrick. We're right up against 2:00. Nicole, do you want to take over here? How does this work for people to register for the next one?
Sure. If you guys would like to use the QR code on this slide, you can register for the October 8th session. A link will also be emailed out to all attendees and people who were unable to attend.
Perfect.
I think we have one more question though in the queue if you want to take a look at the chat.
Okay, while we're doing that, I just want to remind people real quick, this is the way to get a hold of Patrick and I. Yep. The SC4 Nonprofits website is mostly an open access. There's a lot of supporting materials in here. And we will provide the PowerPoint slides when we're done part 2. And we encourage you to reach out to us. But the SC4 website there, you'll find lots of materials on this.
Okay, and if you can't attend the part 2, we'll still send you the slides, but we're not going to send them until after part 2.
And we're recording these if you would like to, right, Nicole? Both parts will be available for people to.
And Kim, we're not able to answer your question, but why don't you email us and we will certainly get back to you, okay?
Oh, definitely. Thank you, everybody. You know we're at 2:00. We appreciate everybody spending time with us.
All right, folks, take care. It's nice, well, not meeting you, but I'm glad you came and listened to us. Appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you all.